But that's good advice. Thank you for that. Oh, I don't know if I told you, but I started working on Trails in the Sky. I'm not very far in yet, but I started my work on that. I'm having a lot of fun with it. The soundtrack's an absolute masterclass. Oh! Oh, is that gonna do it? Gadget Racers. Not the one you're thinking about. Like, seriously. Okay, so I've done this song and dance before, but let's do it again! So, in Japan, there was this series of toys known as Choro Q. They were put out by Takara, and in a brilliant sense of, let's do some cross-promotion, my bobs, they made some video games. A whole heck of a lot of them. They date back to 1986 on the MSX with the first one, and surprisingly, we actually got quite a few of them in the West, but they had some weird name changes. For example, the second game on the PS2 was, in Japan, known as Choro Q, HG2. In fact, 4 of the 5, because the last one had to be confusing and inconsistent in Japan, just had numbers associated with them, which kept it real easy to collect. Here in the West, it was a lot worse. The second game on the PS2 was known as Road Trip, except that we also had games like Road Trip Arcade Edition, Road Trip Shifting Gears, Road Trip Adventure Avenue, which was a working title for this game. Bear in mind, pretty much every single one of these games I've listed has sort of been a completely different legal entity, in some way, shape, or form. The first game in the West on the PS2 was known as Gadget Racers. The second one, of course, as I said, Road Trip, and not to be confused with any of the other instances of Road Trip ever that also exist within this series. But then the third game came out, and they decided to name it Gadget Racers. Yeah, the only defensible reason why this is called Gadget Racers like the original game on the PS2 is because this one never came out in North America, except that that game came out in Europe as Penny Racers, which was like the name of like 5 other games in the series released in North America. See, this whole thing is a giant confuseopoly for no discernible reason other than just region encoding is dumb and screw archivists like me. Really, it's just wildly confusing for archival for no real reason, and if you ever look this up on a ROM site, you'll probably be presented with an Excel spreadsheet just to explain what the heck you're trying to even find. This series is an absolute trip, and it's bizarre that we did eventually adopt the series name for the penultimate Western release. But either way, this is the European exclusive ChoroQ HG3, the sequel to Road Trip. Basically, this is the third one, and in the West, only Europe got it, so we in North America never saw this, but we got something that was identically named for confusion's sake. But the North American release one is a very simple arcade racer that's menu driven. I don't care for it very much compared to the others. This one is kind of weird though. Now the story stars you, not you, the other guy, a randomized car with a randomized body and a probably ugly randomized paint job. It's gonna be a while before you get out of any of those, so you might want to reset a few times. Your goal is to become the greatest supercar mobile ever by challenging the Meister, except that no one knows who he is or where he is, except it's really obvious because he's wildly suspicious. But either way, you need to exist in this world where an apocalypse occurred and now cars are all sentient and chibi. But it's fine, trust me, it's fine, just go with it. Your whole goal is to ride around the world solving little mysteries and ultimately to compete in events to gain flags, and if you gain all 30, you can challenge the Meister for the title and become the greatest racer of all time. That's sort of it. It's a lot more dumbed down a plot than the previous game had, and it's a lot less interesting, but there are some fun callbacks. A lot of the characters from Road Trip actually show up in here. You get to meet good old ex-President Forrest, named because he's green, who actually reminisces about that time he was president and got really, really bored. You can also find your greatest fangirl and best Joe bro Lisa hanging out here, even though they retranslated her name wrong because L's and R's are hard. I will say, in spite of everything I'm about to complain about this game, it does still maintain the Choro Q charm. It's still very janky, but the writing is clever and cute, and it's a fun world. And that really helps it pull through all the weird sort of punctuation and spacing and even translation and sometimes spelling errors that are in this game. The translation efforts were not the best here, but at the very least the charm does shine through. But I'm not sure it 100% recovers from all the jank and issues this game has, just on top of the regular jank and issues the other games in the series seem to have. This one seems especially rushed and rough around the edges. But basically, it's a very simplistic Choro Q. In fact, I would almost say it's kind of a dumbed down version of Road Trip, and it works in some regards and less so in significant others. The original Road Trip was this huge open world driving game with so much to do, but frequently had huge amounts of downtime. This one does not feature a giant open world, but instead feels closer to almost a successor to Diddy Kong Racing. Don't get too excited by that statement, but instead of having a giant open world or just a bunch of tracks to go through, you have to go through smaller hub worlds to go to races to challenge them. You get flags, you can challenge more by unlocking them with your flags. Get enough flags, you can unlock new hub worlds, which gives you new mini quests to do and adventures to have. Your whole goal is to go around these sort of areas trying to become the best racer, as well as collect custom parts by doing little mini quests and stuff, and it's a lot of fun. However, I do like the structure of this sort of on paper. I think pound for pound it has more content per square inch than Road Trip ever had. Road Trip had a lot more, but because of how much downtime there was, it got boring from time to time. But here, you find yourself going from place to place a lot quicker, and there's more to see, just comparatively to how much you're actually doing to get in between those 2 points. But at the same time, there is significantly less stuff to do here, and it feels a lot lower quality, in general, as an experience. I think the big issue about this game, sort of featuring an open world game and being sort of gated behind progress at the same time, those two concepts are kind of antithetical to one another in a sense. You have to ultimately go through these races to get flags in order to beat the game. To get those flags, you have to make your car better, but to get the parts to make your car better, you have to go to new areas. But to get to that, you have to have those flags from beating races. It kind of creates a catch-22 of you need better stuff so that you can advance to get better stuff, but half the time the opponents you're racing have that better stuff. At one point in the first world, I ended up racing all these cars that had like these water modded options. I did not, and that actually made the race almost unwinnable because like the track had such a huge water section, and you don't get like the hovercraft or the boat until like the third area, which requires you to clear almost a third of the game to get to you. It's really bizarre to see that like you'll just run into cars that have like these not quite end game options or anything, but stuff you won't be able to get until you unlock the barest minimum of all the world. And yet you need to go through them in order to unlock them. It feels like you're absolutely punching upwards, and it almost feels hopeless at times. The courses are brilliant, and racing itself is a lot of fun when you get different gadgets, and there's a lot of customization to your car, even though lots of parts overlap multiple areas, so you can't actually utilize every part you'd like. There's a lot of strategy in building your car, it's quite clever. While there is a lot of great use to your car's abilities, it still feels like you never stack up to your opponents, and you either need to drive significantly better than them, or you need to find some way of cheating. And the thing is, it's really hard to drive significantly better than your opponents when your car handles like a walrus. And not a cool party walrus. No, I'm talking about a bloated, constipated walrus dying in the desert heat. That's the kind of walrus your car handles like. But unlike Road Trip, which had a similar problem, that game also had upgrades to your steering column, which let you steer a lot better. This game doesn't. As far as I can tell, there is no way to actually increase your ability to turn in any meaningful way. You can modify your handling slightly with your tires, but that mostly just affects grip more than your actual turning radius. And outside of one body mod that kind of completely changes the way your entire car turns, it pretty much controls like a brick no matter what you do. And it just feels sluggish and awkward to try and get this thing to turn around corners and try and out-corner your opponents, which makes the racing feel really unfun in a lot of scenarios because you're just racing enemies that feel significantly better than you, and you don't even have the ability to utilize skill to try and beat them because the game just responds really sluggishly to you. It's not a fun situation to get yourself into, and the way they sort of put all these upgrades behind unlocking new areas, but requiring you to beat enemies that have those upgrades before you get them, it feels really, really grim. And yeah, there is to a certain degree an ability to choose which races you want to go to. You could certainly go to a different area and try and challenge a weaker track. It still feels like your opponents are always better equipped than you, and that's just not fun. And speaking of equipment and customization, while there is a lot of parts there, and I mean, there's some cool combinations here, and apparently if you combine certain horns with paint schemes and decals, you can get like bonuses and stuff, so I couldn't really find any tangible way of testing this or indeed any sort of result. That's a neat idea. There's lots of parts on your car that just feel underutilized, and there are upgrade bits that you can throw on your car that take up multiple slots, so you can have like slots on your car that are completely vestigial and useless and will never actually get taken up by something because of it. Likewise, because of some of the questing stuff, you have to actually like remove parts to actually carry stuff. One of the longest quests in this game is carrying statues from this shop to random NPCs in all the different hubs, and that requires you to not have a part on your head, which means if you like jumping, which is an important skill in this game, you can't use the helicopter thing that actually makes jumping worth anything, because you'll be carrying a frog on your head. But another huge deal in terms of customization that really hurts this game is the fact that customizing your car is really, really hard on a base level. Like I said, when you start, your car is randomly colored and it's a random body. If you want a specific body, like say the legendary Tofu Drift Machine, well, you get it by gacha. Every race you win, you get one random body out of a small pool that each race has. That's it. So you better get real lucky and know where the body you want is located. And as for color, well, yeah, if you want to change your color, you have to get to the final hub, which again requires you to get through about a third of the game to get to. It ain't great. It's also worth noting that this game is in general very, very exceptionally buggy. Now, I don't have a PAL PS2 for my copy to run on, so I'm running off my modded Japanese PS2. So that might be the issue, but while there is a fast travel system in this game to instantly go from whatever race you've unlocked from your garage to any other hubs or whatever, it's just literally a fast travel to any race or any place you've been from your starting point. If you go anywhere that isn't the sort of main hub that your starting point is located in, at least in my experience, the game crashed. And I mean like a hard lock, you have to turn off your entire PS2 and like reset the whole thing. It was a nightmare to deal with, so I just ended up not having to deal with that. And that could be exceptionally problematic considering that the final race requires you to have some suboptimal equipment to get to. So you'd have to like go there, unlock it, go back to your house, modify your car, and then fast travel there. Fortunately, it's where your house is on the map, so it doesn't load anything and crash, so you can do it, but if it wasn't, that would be basically game destroying. And that's not even the worst of it. But I will say that the worst of it might also be the best of it. See, I found something rather weird in this game. This game has a dedicated screen for if you break the boundaries of the world and kind of sort of soft lock the game. See, there's this one body, it's the hovercraft, and it is like the best thing in the world because you can just ricochet off walls. Unlike every other car, if you hit a wall, you don't stop, and if you jump, you actually maintain your momentum. And if you hit the back end of your car, you get a momentum boost. But I guess the walls weren't programmed super solid or anything, because I think it checks collision every other frame or something like that. Because sometimes you can just get wedged in the wall, ricocheted into the wall itself, and then ricocheted out for like super speed. Like my car's max speed was like 200 miles per hour or whatever. I think I capped at like 1400 at one point. And sometimes the walls are just magnetic, and sometimes you fly into them, and sometimes you get stuck and the game crashes. At one point I think I kind of clipped through the floor and broke the game that way too. The collision with the walls in this game, especially with the hovercraft body, which is one of the most important body mods you can get in this game because it's a land, ice, and watercraft. You can do a lot with it. Yeah, they didn't test how this actually works with the collision, and it kind of breaks the game wide open, and sometimes just breaks the game. And the fact that it's here in the state it is, and I frequently, unintentionally mind you, found myself staring at, oops, I think you went a little too fast, let's send you back to the start, over and over again. The fact that they have this crash screen for this exact situation feels very weird, and like they didn't test it properly, and it was just a fail-safe because they knew it would happen in some capacity. It's very strange. And while there are a lot of side quests to do in this game, a lot of them are basically just go to one place, talk to an NPC, go to another, talk to another. Occasionally you'll get like a quest where you have to round up a band, which means talking to several random NPCs that have slightly different instrument tracks, and you need to combine them all in a way that makes people happy, I guess. I don't know, I never really invested too much time in that because talking to them was a huge waste. But a lot of the side quests just weren't that interesting compared to the previous game, which had all sorts of mini games dotted around the map. It had, of course, you know, go here, talk to this guy, but sometimes it had collect random object. It was a game where you had to build a team. It felt far more mechanically complex than this game. This feels like a significant downgrade. Honestly, if you look beyond the fact that the smaller hubs allow you to get to content quicker, and pound for pound it feels a little bit better in terms of it being more of a content-rich environment, this game feels like just a straight-up downgrade of Road Trip in pretty much every respect, and it's downright buggy. I think the tracks are a little bit better designed than Road Trip. There are still 90-degree angle turns all over the place for whatever reason, but they do feel at least a little bit better, but I think they're far more forgettable than Road Trips ever were, with maybe one or two exceptions. At its core, this does feel like a sequel to Road Trip, but in a lot of ways, it feels like Road Trip, its predecessor, was an upgrade. And that's not saying that this is necessarily bad, but it has a lot to live up to, and it falls short in pretty much all regards. The overall presentation to Gadget Racers, no, not that one, is, you know, it's decent. It looks pretty much like Road Trip, and, you know, SD cars are goofy and fun to look at. I like all the crazy mods and things you can do, and the customization is pretty solid once you actually, you know, get to a point where you're allowed to actually customize yourself. That's fun. Although I will say it feels like the car variety is a lot less interesting. Sure, you had to get to the end of the game in Road Trip to see all the, like, the super, super crazy car designs, but that game just felt like it had more, you know? Audio-wise, I think this game is pretty much entirely forgettable. Like, the one song on the soundtrack that really struck me, as sad as it is, was a song that was literally lifted from Road Trip as a reference to it. Which isn't necessarily a bad thing. I mean, once again, it was the best song on Road Trip too, I think. But it just made everything else in here seem really kind of bland and disinteresting. Overall, the presentation to Road Trip 2 Electric Boogaloo, this is called Gadget Racers, is okay. Like, it's serviceable, and, you know, the presentation on the series is great, but I think the soundtrack and the somewhat lacking in variance of cars is not quite as interesting as earlier iterations, again, like Road Trip, but it's okay. I think the soundtrack is pretty much a wash, though, unfortunately. Now, if you want a copy of Gadget Racers on the PS2, well, cheapest copy I'm seeing right now is $12 plus shipping. But of course, that's the Western version that we got, and not the PAL version I'm actually talking about here. Again, it's convoluted. If you want a PAL version of Gadget Racers, which is the third game, and, you know, the game I'm actually talking about here, cheapest copy I'm seeing right now is $40, but bear in mind you're gonna have to ship it from the United Kingdom, which is basically an additional $40. And I will say that that is significantly more than the one that we got in the West, but I will say this one's better, although significantly buggier. Our version of Gadget Racers, or rather the original Gadget Racers we got in the West, was a perfectly serviceable game, but it just wasn't as interesting. It lacks the sort of adventure and sort of RPG elements, and it's a shame because I do like the sort of car PG mechanics that Gadget Racers has, and half the Choro Q games tended to have, even though most of the ones we got tended to be more arcadey in general. That said, you could also get Road Trip, which I think is at its core, thanks brain, at its core, a significantly better game with significantly more content. Yes, there's also a significant amount of downtime to get there, but I do think it is, at its core, a significantly better game with significantly better polish and content. I mean, you can build your own town in that game. You can't do that here. Here it's just race a few times, do a few side quests, move on to the next town, do it all again until you beat the game. And hopefully you don't clip through the ground or wall and have to restart like I did numerous times. And for the love of God, don't fast travel. You might break the game. That might be because of how I had to play it, but again, given how buggy this game is, I'm not putting it past it that might actually just be how the game natively runs. Either way, it's not a bad game. It's a fun Choro Q adventure, and I do love these games. I want to collect them all, and I've made strides to get there, certainly. I mean, I'm only missing one of the 5 PS2 games at this point, but I will say that when you compare it to Road Trip, it just doesn't stack up. And while it's been forever since I've played the sequel to this game, the actual game we got called Choro Q, I remember that game being significantly better too. But I still think Road Trip is the best game in the series thus far. And I mean, that game is currently like $15 on eBay. And I mean, there's a lot of downtime, but there's a lot more going on, and it's a lot more fun, I think. This game, I would only recommend if you really want the full set like I do, but, you know, if you just want one Choro Q game, I would say get Choro Q, which is the 4th game on the PS2, or Road Trip, which was the 2nd, and you'll have a lot more fun. But this is a weird little collectible that only made it to the PAL territories in the West, and if nothing else, it makes it interesting to talk about. But I don't think this is peak Choro Q. Alright, gotta watch this wall. I've gotten stuck in that wall at one point. Oh, and I think we're there. Okay. Yeah. That's what I was afraid of.